Hello, everybody. Natural Resources Committee, Hansi, etc. This is an introduction to the biology and diets of pinnipeds in Western Washington. I will be focusing almost exclusively on seals, but we'll touch very briefly on sea lions. And then, depending on how long this runs, I may roll into some policy information, or I may stop recording and come back to the policy information later in a separate presentation. So there are 4 pinnipeds that a person might come across in Western Washington. These include the harbor seal, shown in the top left, the California sea lion in the top right, and then less frequently northern elephant seals in the bottom left corner, and stellar sea lions down here in the bottom right. And the 2 most common are, in fact, harbor seal and the California sea lion. Harbor seals do not have external ears, as the California sea lion does. And then you'll also notice that their front flippers are really different. Harbor seals cannot prop themselves up or move or walk on those 2 front flippers, whereas the California sea lion does so pretty much all of the time. This results in the harbor seal moving sort of like a person doing the worm, or like in that general pattern. I'm sure there's a better term for it. Whereas California sea lions will prop themselves up on those front legs and use them to move their body. They can actually also put their tail down and use their front flippers and their tail to sort of walk or even run, making them a little bit better suited to movement or quicker movement on land. Additionally, the northern elephant seal is quite gigantic and relatively rare. This one in the image in the foreground is a male, and you'll notice that really large appendage in the front of their face that's pretty distinct and only in males. And then these are females on the beach around the male. And then here on the bottom right, we have a stellar sea lion, also called a northern sea lion. And they are quite a bit larger than California sea lions, but built relatively similarly. And in both California and stellar sea lions, there's pretty significant or moderate sexual dimorphism, with males being larger than females. In this case, the California sea lion is a female and the stellar sea lion is a male. There's also some differences in the thickness of their neck and the shape of their head. It's a pretty good way to tell them apart, the males from the females. And then generally, stellar sea lions are quite a lot larger than the California sea lions. These are 2 closer up images of a harbor seal. Notice the lack of exposed ears, and again, the front flippers cannot really be laid or placed into the ground to help lift that body up. And on the left is a Pacific Ocean harbor seal. On the picture on the right, looks very similar, maybe slightly different. That's because it's an Atlantic Ocean harbor seal. So that probably segues nicely into the question of their range. Harbor seals are found across much of the northern hemisphere, at least the northern latitudes of the northern hemisphere. So that's the North Pacific and the North Atlantic Oceans on both east and west shores. They do live throughout the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Puget Sound, and Hood Canal. And breeding occurs locally, which it does not do, at least not with any frequency or any regularity with California sea lions. But yes, harbor seals are breeding. You will see females with pups throughout the spring and summer on a lot of the haul-out sites around here. And harbor seals are very opportunistic feeders with varied diets. They are very capable of switching between prey species and can do so even in a single feeding. They can shift between different prey sources. This is the opposite of something like northern resident killer whales, which are fixed into a single prey species, or even sea otters, which tend to have a hard time switching once they learn a single food source. They don't tend to stray too far from that. Not the case with harbor seals, and that's probably helped them have really robust and widespread populations, like we see in this map. So within Washington, there are 4 harbor seal stocks. Stocks are mostly independent breeding populations as determined by genetic analysis and movement data. I should note that these are not hard boundaries, and both in terms of the seals, they move in between these stocks with some frequency, and also as research continues, new stocks have been added and those boundaries have been adjusted. But think of these as sort of the scale at which management occurs, and we will talk about each of these stocks in somewhat independent fashion. And if you look at this map, each stock is shown in a different color. So along the coast, we have the Washington Coast stock, and then from Neah Bay into basically the northern part of Puget Sound and Hood Canal, we have the northern inland stock, and this covers Dungeness Bay, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and all of the San Juan Islands. There's a lot of connectivity from the San Juan Islands south. And then you also have the Hood Canal stock and southern Puget Sound stock as separate entities. We're going to focus primarily on the northern inland stock here in red and the Hood Canal stock shown in green, just because that is more within the slalom UNA. So if we look at the mean annual seal counts by stock, we'll focus on the north inland right here. You can see that runs around 8,000-ish adult seals and around 2,000, 2,500 pups over the last couple of years. I should note adult seals are in blue, the pups are in green, and the confidence interval is this shade of blue, which shows you the potential range of seal populations, and then the most likely prediction is that blue line. So you can focus on the blue line, but understand that these are not perfect estimates. This is a mathematical process with a lot of uncertainty, and so there is a range of population estimates. We can also look at Hood Canal. You'll see this is a lot fewer animals, but it's also been relatively steady since even the late 1980s. Okay, now I'm going to show you maps of the haul out sites. This will just help us understand the relative distribution of seals within these two stocks. There are absolutely going to be seals that spend time not on land. They can spend a lot of time in the water, days or weeks on end. I think days might be a little bit more common, but they can go prolonged periods of time without hauling out at certain times of year when they have really young pups. The females in particular are significantly more landlocked, and when they're molting, they're more landlocked. So there are times when they're not moving. This just helps you understand distributions. So a huge number of haul-out sites up in the San Juan Islands, and then a handful of sites along the southern side of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. This publication is from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. It does not cover any of the Canadian haul-out sites, so it wouldn't show you what's on the south side of Vancouver Island. Note that the larger the red dot is, the more seals that are hauled out there. So we can see that there are some pretty significant haul-out sites throughout this northern inland stock, which makes sense given the large population size. And then Hood Canal, you'll note there are a number of haul-out sites here. This is not showing the California sea lions that are hauled out at Bangor. This is, again, just harbor seals. And you'll see here quilcene, dozy wallops, the duckabush, and the hamma. All of those river mouths have haulouts, as does the Skokomish River. So our major rivers appear to be highly correlated with haulout sites and probably with feeding. All of this was flown in the summer when there is pupping and the tides are a little bit more conducive to animals being hauled out as opposed to in the winter. And so that could also be skewing this a little bit. Just be aware that all of this data was collected in the summer. Okay, now we're looking at abundance estimates, which is relatively similar to the two figures ago, population estimates. The thing I want you to pay attention here is K, which is carrying capacity. That's an estimated carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is not as linear and fixed as this indicates over time, but we're trying to approximate carrying capacity year to year. That can change based upon climatic conditions, a bunch of other variables, food availability, temperatures, who knows what. A lot of factors go into carrying capacity, but if we are trying to sort of estimate carrying capacity, This is where WDFW and presumably NOAA thinks carrying capacity is. If we are looking at the northern inland stocks, what we see, northern inland stock, what we see here is that after the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, once these counts are being done consistently, we see really, really steady growth, and that trajects its way on up to carrying capacity, and it looks like this northern inland stock has been relatively stable right around carrying capacity for about a decade. And then if we work over to Hood Canal, we will also see that post passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, we get increasing populations. Maybe data collection was a little bit more spotty here through the 80s, but coming into the 90s, we see that this exceeds carrying capacity slightly, and then over the last 2.5 decades has been hovering around carrying capacity. I will note that this rapid decline in the early 2000s, I believe, was the result of a handful of transient killer whales moving into the canal, and they spent an entire summer there. Not only did they eat a very large number of seals, they also probably changed behaviors a little bit and scared a number of seals out of there. And then it seems like things have really settled out and the number of seals has been relatively stable. I will note that in some years, carrying capacity is probably functionally higher, in some years it's lower, and in terms of seal populations, expect that disease dynamics and food availability, as well as haul out availability, are probably some of the biggest factors that could influence where that carrying capacity sits in any given year. So then if we combine all four stocks, we start to look at statewide abundance estimates. And you can see here that also following the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, we have a steady increase up and up and up and up until we start to get to what looks like we're leveling off, and we're probably approaching carrying capacity. Note that this stopped in 2000. This is an older figure, and since then, not much has changed. We see that most likely Washington State is at or very, very near carrying capacity. If we go back to some of the earlier slides, I believe South Puget Sound still has a little ways to go, even coming into 2020. The population is a bit below expected carrying capacity. Okay, that is about it for population size. Now let's shift into seal home ranges and how they move through space. So in this image, we are looking at one female seal who was tagged. I believe she was tagged up in the San Juan Islands. And here we are looking at Vancouver Island, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the San Juans. And you'll see that here on the left, this is pre-pupping. So this would have been probably the winter into early spring. She spread her time between the eastern side of the San Juan Islands and then the outer edges of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Note that she had a lot of time in the middle of the strait, was not necessarily land-based, but more marine-based. And on the right is during pupping, maybe post-pupping, and again, lots of time in the San Juan Islands, but also some time being closer in this sort of more eastern part of the strait and touching both Canada and the land out near, I guess that would be CQ, or just east of CQ. Here we have another seal, same arrangement where the left is pre-pupping, so this is a female. And you'll note that this seal moved between the two stocks, moved between this northern inland stock and the Puget Sound stock. Also spent a lot of time over again the San Juans, and then headed on south down into Puget Sound, and had a pretty similar pattern during the pupping season, but was more focused within Puget Sound. And I think this is just a demonstration that these seals are capable of moving long distances pretty quickly, and they are not stationary to a single or permanently attached to a single hull out site. They are, in fact, moving around quite a bit, moving between stocks, moving between feeding areas, and meeting their needs, whatever those might be, across large spatial areas. I should also note that California sea lions are a little bit different in that they're not breeding up this way. So we have more of an inundation of males through the summer, and then they head farther south through the winter. and females tend to be very, very rare up this direction. There's very little in the way of breeding populations of California sea lions. We will shift into diets. So I should note that the methods used to analyze pinniped diets have changed quite a lot, and it's only the last few years that we've been able to use, genetic analyses of the feces um, or their tissue samples to really delve in and see the full variety of species. Before that, there was other techniques used. Some of it was observation of actual feeding habits. Some of it was identification of hard parts within feces, but those probably did a little bit less to show how varied these diets could be. I think for most of these publications, I'm going to reference a gentleman out of Canada named Austin Thomas, who does a lot of this work, sort of pioneered the genetic analysis. So this is work in 2022 where he took thousands of samples across both the Strait of Georgia, so that's up in Canada, and Puget Sound. And what we see here is a breakdown. We have 4,600 fecal samples, and we see here a breakdown of the species found therein. So by far and away, the two most commonly consumed species were Pacific hake and Pacific herring, together making up 46% of all of these seals' diets. But then, third one is chum, making up about 6%. And as we work our way down through the less commonly consumed species, we also see Chinook, pinks, sockeye, coho, and steelhead, all making up a decent proportion of these seals' diets. And this study has been using similar but not identical methods been replicated across other parts of Puget Sound, and these results are pretty comparable. In general, we see figures in the range of 6% to 20% of seal diets being made up of salmonids. That'll probably also vary seasonally, particularly in the spring when you have, or summer when you have out-migrating smolts. It's going to make up significantly less because there's so little biomass associated with each one of those small fish. Whereas in the fall, you could see this being a higher proportion of the diet because you have very large fish that are coming back, and catching a single fish is probably easier and results in a lot more biomass being consumed. Okay, this one's a little bit technical, a lot of data going on here. Also a study by Thomas using some older methods. He was looking at the percent of diet in both juvenile salmon and adult salmon across different species of salmon, so Chinook up here, chum, and sockeye. And so what we see is that consumption of particularly Chinook and sockeye really sort of peaks in the spring to early summer, where around 2 to 4% of diet is made up of these smolts. And then we see in the fall that we have into early winter, we have a lot more consumption of these large adults, and again, it makes up a larger portion of their diet because they're bigger fish. And this also illustrates that these diets are going to vary seasonally with prey abundance. We would likely see this reflected on the Dungeness River, or probably almost any other bay associated with a salmon-bearing river, where we're going to see consumption of juveniles when juveniles are available and adults when they are available, and in larger amounts. Okay, and this was a study by a different author looking at the consumption of juvenile salmonids, so again, smolts, and looking at the proportion of the diet across multiple years. And what I want to point out here is that there are a whole lot of zeros in any given year. We are seeing that most seals in this study were not eating salmon. So in this case, there was 1,000, let me make this a little clearer. Here's our year, 2016. There were 1,086 samples taken. In 2017, there were 289 samples taken. In 2018, there were 582 samples taken. Looking at the proportion of the diet that are Chinook versus coho being consumed by seals, harbor seals. What we see is that most harbor seals are not eating any juvenile Chinook or coho, but a small number that varies year to year are in fact eating a much larger portion, some of those making up 100% of their diet. That seems to be pretty consistent across years, although I note here that in 2018, there seemed to be a lot more consumption of juveniles than there was in the previous 2 years, and the author did not, I think, hypothesize why that was the case. But this illustrates that a small number of seals can be a significant problem for these smolts, and that the amount of salmon, the number of salmon, and the biomass, total biomass, can be highly variable year to year, depending on some multitude of conditions. So that's a segue into the work that we are doing. And so Tori and I have been working with In-Dungeness Bay. We're both doing seal counts to understand how and where our local seals are hauling out and how that varies seasonally, how many there are, etc. And then we are also collecting their feces so that we can do that same analysis that was done by Austin Thomas, and we can look at the genetic material within the feces and understand how their diets are composed and how that changes year over year, or even season over season, month over month. I just thought these were some kind of cool pictures. This is a harbor seal eating a salmon. This was taken off of Facebook. I don't know who the author is, but they said it was in either Squim Bay or Dungeness Bay. And then this is my wife with a bearded seal that she trained. Not the same kind of seal you saw here, but just cool. Let's do a very, very brief introduction into California sea lions, just so that you can have a rough idea what's happening there, and if there is interest in a similar recap of California sea lion populations and diets, there are a number of local papers on sea lions as well, and I can do a similar debrief or a similar synopsis of California sea lions, just like I did here with seals. The one thing that I want to show you is the huge amount of body size difference between males and females. The males are gargantuan. And one thing that really stands out is, I think this is called the sagittal crest. It's the shape of their head and this sort of hump onto their upper forehead and the back of their head that the females really don't have. So if they're in the water and you don't have such a clear way of understanding or seeing if it's a male or female, because the body is a little bit more hidden, the head is the best indication to understand if you're looking at a male or a female. And California sea lions are not nearly so broadly distributed. They must feel a bit better in slightly warmer climates. So you see they run down through Baja California and then up to about Puget Sound, being sort of the northern extent. And they are not breeding within Puget Sound, or if they are, it's very, very rare. What we're seeing is almost exclusively males in Puget Sound, and especially that's the case in the fall through the summer outside of the breeding season, and then they're heading down to where the females are for the spring and summer breeding season. If you are in Hood Canal in particular, that's where I've seen the most California sea lions, and you hear that sort of or barking sound, that is California sea lions. Harbor seals make more of a barking sort of dog noise, and so when you hear that particular sound that you probably associate with Bangor bass, that is in fact California sea lions. And again, most prolific in the winter, although you could see them year round. I think I'm going to stop here, and I will record separately for an update on some of the policy options, potential ways to change how seals are being managed, how pinnipeds are being managed, and some of the ramifications of federal law like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and ways that might be amended or altered, things that have been done in the past. And I think I'll cover that in a separate presentation. Thank you. Reach out to me if you have any questions, and I would be happy to share the publications that those figures came from or any of the dietary information as well. All right, take care.